In the glass silence of the museum hall lies a cold rim of darkened metal. It looks like material evidence of someone else's power over the body. A lock, hinges, serrated edges, like a miniature fortress wall. The label promises centuries of history, but the paper tells a different story. In property inventories, marriage lists, court and consistory records, there is much talk of chests, keys, ribbons, dowries, fines, and guardianship, and almost complete silence about the iron on the body. Metal in the display case, silence in the documents of the era, and it is this discrepancy that is more disturbing than any spike. I welcome the viewers, thank you for your attention, and for the time devoted to this complex topic. It is important to me to know which cities and countries are watching this episode, so please write about it in the comments so that we can see our map. And I wish you a calm but focused listening experience, because from now on, we will be talking not about legends, but about papers that resist loud words. When you pull everyday threads out of the archives, control appears unsentimental and petty. The house was divided into spheres of access: the master's chests, keys in the hands of elders, guardianship and suretyship, receipts and pledges, community penalty books where misdemeanors and amounts to be paid to the treasury or the poor were recorded. Marriage contracts did not mention iron belts on the body, but clearly specified the dowry and property regime. What remained the wife's personal property? What became joint property? Who had the right to open chests containing documents and coins? Who was responsible for debts? How the income from a shop or workshop was divided? And who would receive the keys and seals to the barns in the event of illness or death? This was the mechanism of power: property, access, assigned responsibilities, the ability to punish with the purse. In city charters and parish court statutes, control over the adult body was expressed through reputation and wallet. Penitential pilgrimages, monetary penalties, bans on public gatherings, deprivation of rights in the craft, rare but tangible corporal punishment were imposed. Violence as a social fact was present, but it was part of a system where money, property, and the courts remained the main instruments of control. The first turning point came when researchers began to look at metal as an industrial product. Technological expertise identifies signs of late manufacture: uniform sheet rolling, machine symmetry of lock teeth, standardized screw connections, and an alloy composition characteristic of the industrial century. Instead of the hand forging of a workshop master, there is the precision of factory stamping. Where the plaque promised depth of time, the metal revealed a different connection. The display cases of modern curiosity cabinets, where anatomical models, scientific curiosities, and moral warnings were accompanied by objects created not for life, but for viewing. Some museums changed their captions over time. Cautious wording about presumed purpose, about the tradition of late attribution, about the possibility of reconstruction. And the myth took a step back, but did not go away. It was too convenient an image. The second twist is hidden in the press, leaflets, and satirical books of the new era. Illustrated moralistic scenes invented iron belts as witty symbols of control over desire, as a caricature of jealousy, as a subject for fairground gossip. Pamphlets promised secret anatomies of vice, and publishers knew the price of a spicy hint. Here, the belt became not an everyday object, but a theatrical detail, an amplifier of the story. The public paid for the feeling of touching a forbidden past, and rare item dealers tailored the image to expectations. Other devices of late morality lived nearby, not for family life, but as medical remedies against sin and fantasy, created to control adult bodies. They were born of a different era, where factory and moralizing went hand in hand, and the body was already seen as an object of technical intervention. This proximity gave the iron image new oxygen and suggested ready-made legends to the museum. The third shift is noticeable in the papers of judicial and ecclesiastical authorities in old cities. Consistory registers meticulously recorded misdemeanors, family quarrels, breaches of marital fidelity among adults, and detailed confessions, fines, terms, and guarantors, even private agreements on separate living arrangements. City statutes contained provisions on night patrols, bans on certain types of entertainment, propriety in dress and gestures, and fines for violations. Guild statutes prescribed prohibitions on receiving guests in the workshop after a certain hour, the duties of apprentices, and punishments for disobedience. None of these documents required the wearing of metal on the body as a routine control measure. Control worked differently. Through the distribution of keys, the right to access rooms, the guarding of staircases and courtyards, scheduled supervision, the threat of court action, and poverty. If anyone mentioned extreme measures in their reports, it remained a rumor, an emotional exaggeration, a tool for putting pressure on someone's reputation. The archive preferred completely different tools: paper, stamps, and signatures. The myth, however, benefited from a different memory device. In the 19th and 20th centuries, showcases sought drama, and popular publications built bridges to a dark antiquity that supposedly explained the present. Tourists waited for excitement, collectors for rarities, museums for a stream of visitors. Cities liked the legend in which the past of others seemed cruel and the present progressive. The belt became a mirror in which the modern viewer saw their own fears, projecting them onto ancient times. From this perspective, iron spoke louder than the boring accounting of marriage contracts and inventories of chests. Thus, a sensational exhibition replaced the archive, and a late object replaced the long history of institutions where power over the adult body was distributed through wallets, property, and signatures. Taken together, these lines reveal a clear pattern. Where museum legend promises an iron rule, documents demonstrate the paper economy of the body. Marriage as a contract with a list of obligations and guarantees, guardianship as a legal form of control, fines as a language of punishment, court as a machine of reputation. These are the everyday levers that made actions tangible. Cases of cruelty existed as companions to the system, but the usual mechanisms remained money, access, a room, a key, a seal. The metal in the display case is frightening because it is tangible, but the fear of historical reality is more subtle. It is written out in full in a notarial deed, hung on the door of the master's chest, secured by guarantors, and turned into a cold line of punishment. And the louder the lock on the belt rattles in the imagination, the easier it is to overlook the quiet creak of the lock on the chest, from which the spouse or guardian takes coins, papers, and the power to dispose of adult life. The second layer of this story emerges where boring financial books unexpectedly become a map of power. In Italian cities of mature communes, the marriage of an adult was recorded not by romance, but by a notarial line. Property, dowry, guardianship, rights of access to the house and shop. In cities where order and seals were valued, special funds were invented that turned marriage into a long-term financial project for the family. Dowry institutions accumulated contributions and promised payment to the bride upon marriage. It was not iron on the body that controlled destiny, but bonds, keys to chests, and written rights. It was not complicated locks for belts that were brought into the house, but painted chests, massive, with iron overlays, known as wedding boxes. They had their own locks, double lids, and sometimes two sets of keys, distributed between the spouses and the elders of the house. In disputes over access to these chests, the court decided who had the right to open them and when, who was responsible for any loss, and what penalty was imposed for breaking and entering. In the household accounts, a key meant more than any belt. It was the key that separated mine from ours and under guardianship. The paradox is simple. Where myth offers iron on skin, the document shows iron on the wood of the chest. Iberian codes of law from the adult era emphasized the same logic. The rules on marriage, dowry, and property spoke of the shares guaranteed to the wife, the husband's rights to manage the common property, and the exceptions when the wife's property remained outside his control. Adult misdemeanors were punished with money, repentance, temporary restrictions, and sometimes exile. Judges clearly preferred the pen to the sword. They broke down conflicts into property consequences and social sanctions. A separate mechanism existed to control adult bodies: reputation, confirmed by paper documents. Violations did not result in metal scars, but rather entries in a book and heavy financial consequences. In English parishes, cases of violations of marital obligations among adults were settled in ecclesiastical courts, where morality and discipline were defined as a public good. There, penitential walks were prescribed, participation in celebrations was prohibited, fines were imposed, and guarantors were required. Secular jurisdiction in urbanizing centers preferred peace treaties, special receipts under which the conflicting parties were obliged not to harm each other and the community, under threat of a large monetary penalty. Control over a person's body grew out of control over their economy and social visibility, rather than from the wearing of mechanisms. The community considered reputation to be a resource, and the court to be its cashier. Metal in this accounting played a role only on doors, chests, and shop shutters. In German cities, craft guilds loved detail. Apprentices were forbidden from making night visits, and masters were instructed to secure bolts and check who remained in the house after dark. House rules determined the distribution of rooms, quiet hours, household duties, and punishments for disobedience. Violations were punished with fines and temporary suspensions from work. The key was a symbol of responsibility. It indicated who in the house controlled the movement of people and goods, who allowed, who forbade, who bore the material risk. When later collections showed the public iron devices, supposedly designed to be worn on the body, this image did not find a counterpart in the statutes, which loved lists of prohibitions and duties. If wearing them was a routine form of control, it would be logical to find traces of it in the same genre, where the most mundane details were listed, from the length of sleeves to night patrols. But the paper remained silent. Meanwhile, a different story was developing in the press of the new era, and it became one of the main turning points in this story. Illustrated moral lessons and satirical sheets, which liked to talk about vice in the guise of parables, brought out the iron belt as a witty symbol of jealousy and control over adult desires. Over time, collectors' cabinets of curiosities and museums, which emerged at the intersection of science and fairground wonders, began to feature items made as rarities of old customs. They were forged not for domestic use, but for the eye. They had to look convincing and alarming. The metal gleamed, the locks clicked, the spikes frightened. And all this suited the taste of the public, brought up on the idea that the past was necessarily harsher and darker. Later, examinations revealed standardized parts and alloys, pointing to industrial origins, but the legend was stronger. The museum display case reliably produced emotion, and that emotion was easier to sell than a long explanation about statutes and court records. The reliable traces of control in old cities are not belts at all, but networks of obligations that enveloped adults. In Italy, marriage was often accompanied by a record of what items remained the property of the wife, what the rules were for accessing chests and keys, and how shares were calculated in the event of separate residence. Medical ideas were close at hand, adding layers of meaning to the conversation about the body. City doctors and moralists considered moderation and restraint to be beneficial to health and public tranquility. but their prescriptions concerned lifestyle, clothing, nutrition, staircases in houses, and street lighting. The authorities' concern for order of the senses resulted in closing times for taverns, bans on games, and dancing on certain days, supervision of bathhouses and public houses for adults, and control over servants and apprentices. All this was recorded, discussed, and reviewed. Metal on the body would have been an alien element in this legislative routine. Too crude, too ostentatious, and too inconvenient for everyday practice, where the vague power of paper punishment and the calculable fear of poverty were valued. Another line shows who benefited from the myth in the new era. When industrial cities were anxiously thinking about the mobility of women, work in factory buildings, mass reading, and public leisure, the iron belt became a simple image that turned complex fears into something understandable. Show the object, and you no longer need to talk about wages, housing, night streets, legal protection for adults, or medical discussions about corporal punishment. The myth functioned as an ideological label. It replaced talk of institutions of control with talk of past atrocities, allowing present anxieties to be voiced in the form of safe condemnation of other centuries. In this mirror, any modern measure seemed mild and almost humane. The removable reality of iron helped to divert attention from the real mechanisms of today's control over the body: insurance, labor contracts, moral prescriptions, office codes, cameras, and unwritten rules. Meanwhile, traces of a completely different kind of iron continued to multiply in the sources of old centuries. These were door plates on chests and rooms, steel hinges on shop shutters, padlocks on barns, seizures of property sealed with seals, and the very keys that passed from hand to hand by court order or notarial record. They were accompanied by fines for breaking and entering, public apologies for violating house rules, and monetary guarantees of good behavior. Cases of physical violence existed as a social fact and were recorded as offenses involving adult participants. But even then, the language of punishment was accounting-like: fines, sureties, temporary bans, sometimes expulsion. The paper explained that power over an adult's body is primarily power over their access to space, resources, and reputation. The focus was on what could be opened and what would be opened for you without asking, not on what was permanently riveted to your skin. And yet, even the most cautious museum captions often clung to convenient labels that guaranteed viewers a quick understanding. Here, we see a structural conflict. The museum legend promises clear, alarming iron, while the archive provides a fragmented but dense geography of control: statutes, penalty books, marriage contracts, reports from city authorities. The first line is simple and visual, the second complex and paper-based. The habit of believing the display case is stronger than the habit of reading protocols. But if we focus on the document, the myth begins to fade. Linen shirts, layered clothing, seasonal work, the architecture of houses, enclosed courtyards and staircases, sets of rights and obligations. All this shows how the body of an adult found itself in a network of norms and economic levers without any theatrical constructions. The key gesture is not to lock the belt, but to turn the key in the door and present the receipt. Therefore, the late iron belt is a convenient metaphor for fear, but a poorly suited tool for describing real power. This sober picture does not soften the past. On the contrary, it removes the mask and shows how everyday and systematic control over adults was: quiet, paper-based, distributed across the functions of home and street, the economy of the shop, and duty to the community. And the more closely we follow the threads of guardianship, property, fines, and courts, the more obvious it becomes that the myth of iron grew out of the desire to have one object that answered all questions. History resists this simplicity. It speaks through a multitude of acts, seals, and keys. In this multitude, we hear what the shop window tried to shout down. Fear is organized not by spikes, but by lines in a notary's book, and it is these lines that cause not ostentatious but real pain, the pain of exclusion, poverty, and shame, depending on the decisions of those who hold the seals and keys. The closer you look at the metal of the display case, the stronger the sting of inconsistency with the fabric of everyday life. In houses where every ribbon was counted, where family marks were stamped on the lids of chests, where keys were kept by elders, control was distributed among rooms and people like water in ditches. The stratification of space was the law. Locked storage rooms, a common dining room under the watchful eye of the household, separate staircases for servants, scheduled shop hours. City regulations listed in detail when it was permissible to make noise, where adults were allowed to gather, how to dress for holidays, and where dancing and games were prohibited. The records show how often the authorities' attention was focused not on bodies bound by iron, but on doors and passageways. Who entered? Who stayed after the permitted hour? Who removed the bolt? Who gave out the key? Who vouched for compliance with the regime? Where violence involving adult participants surfaces, it is described as a social fact with consequences: fines, repentance, deprivation of rights, expulsion. Pain and fear in these cases have an accounting face. They are measured not by thorns, but by sum and term. In later collections, where metal learned to be a symbol, the fairy tale found a confident voice. The new era loved simple explanations for complex anxieties. When factory buildings brought men and women together, when evening streets and gardens became places of public leisure, when cheap presses spread salacious stories, the legend of the iron object provided a convenient metaphor, as if order could be restored with a single shiny lock. The museum caption picked up on this tone because it sold tickets. In the catalogs, other apparatuses of morality appeared alongside it, born of the medical fears of later centuries. They were aimed at adults, promised to keep desire under control, and most often had an industrial trace of manufacture. It was this industrial pedigree that gave away the myth, but the display preferred drama to proof. Thus, the sensational exhibition replaced the archive, and the late object replaced the multi-layered institutions of control. Another shift is provided by the economy of language in cities that survived plague waves and wars, but did not abandon the calculative logic of adult control. After the years of pestilence, the authorities invested in visible order: streetlights, night patrols, bans on crowds, regulation of adult bathhouses and houses of pleasure, and registration of servants and apprentices. The formula is repeated everywhere: reputation as capital, court as cash register, fine as universal whip. And if you look at these books as a map of fear, you can see that fear was driven not by iron details on the body, but by the risk of being outside the community, without access to work and protection. The architecture of houses and courtyards did its job. Walls, locks, bolts, and keys created a micropolitics of access, where an adult could be admitted to or expelled from a room, and this was decided by elders or the court. Sometimes the protocols record extremes, but even there, the center of gravity returns to the one who holds the key, who is entrusted with keeping the chest, who pays the fine. Attention to the document reveals a rare type of material trace: not a leather belt, but a chest, painted in marriage conditions, with iron fittings and a wrought iron lock. These chests become the heroes of court stories. The same formulas are repeated in interrogations and inquiries. Who had the right to open it? Who was present at the opening? What papers and coins were taken out? Where they were taken? Sometimes the court ordered the chest to be sealed with the seal of authority until the dispute was resolved. This was a ritual of control, visible, cold, accompanied by witnesses and records. The body of an adult is indirectly present in this ritual, as a subject of duty and responsibility, as the owner of a share, as a person for whom access to things determines choice and fate. Against the backdrop of this tangible bureaucracy, the display belt resembles a theatrical prop, a successful metaphor, but a poor source. The fourth turn grows out of medicine itself. Late treatises on health, written by doctors who combined observation with moral instruction, teach diet, moderation, and a regime of work and sleep. They discuss nervous diseases of adulthood, prescribe walks and girding in a figurative sense, as discipline, not as a device. Where the medicine of later centuries does indeed produce iron objects, it addresses an adult reader and speaks the language of the factory, not the workshop. Geared parts, screw fasteners, and standardized locks reveal not a craftsman, but an industrial line. Hence the strange geography of the finds. There are almost no everyday references in old books, but there are many late copies with well-preserved surfaces, like objects that were hardly ever worn, but rather displayed. The fifth twist occurs when the museum agrees to look at its own labels. Where there used to be categorical statements, there are now cautious words about the presumed purpose, late reconstructions, and controversial dating. In some collections, items with loud legends are transferred to the category of moral images, and copies of pages from statutes, marriage contracts, and protocols are placed next to them so that the viewer can see the real fabric of control. This gesture rarely causes a cue, but it restores the truth to the story. Power over the adult body did not need constant iron on the skin, because it had at its disposal an entire ecosystem of paper and wooden barriers. Keys, seals, signed access rights, fines, sureties, and courts. This is the chain that clicked every day, without theatrical glamour and without mercy. There is cruelty in this chain, but its weapon is not a spike, but a line. And if you listen to this line, the myth of iron ceases to scream and becomes what it always was, a reflection of fear, which is convenient to hide in the glare of a shop window, instead of acknowledging its paper, cold, slow nature. Where the legend promised an ancient object, the chronicle of modern times shows the circulation of spectacle. Traveling exhibitions of a moralizing nature, closed shows for a wealthy audience, catalogs with ornate fonts and pseudo-medieval frames turn the object into a symbol convenient for moral campaigns. Printed posters promise to lift the veil on the secret of domestic discipline, but the accompanying descriptions featured vague phrases about private collections, a gift from an anonymous collector, and found in an old castle with no exact address, instead of the old owners. Where the archive demanded names and dates, the show offered hints and the rustle of velvet. The technical description, made in the mature era of museum science, noted some unavoidable oddities: identically calibrated holes, convenient for serial riveting, screws of uniform size, no traces of wear where everyday use would have left characteristic marks on the metal, traces of leather details, processed in a manner typical of modern factory workshops, a lock with a standard beard profile, convenient for late lockpicks. On the plaque, all this was drowned out by a single phrase about rarity, while newspaper columns confidently propagated the story of rigorous antiquity, which supposedly explains the current disorder of desires. The scientific service offered cautious wording, asking to indicate presumed purpose and probably late reconstruction. But the publicity department stood its ground. The public comes for excitement, and excitement is provided not by statutes, but by the shine of steel. Thus, sensational exhibitions replaced the archive, and glossy photographs easily overshadowed the dry but accurate page of the marriage contract, which clearly stated who owned the keys to the chests and who would pay the penalty for non-compliance with the house rules. This was the convenience of the myth. It replaced a complex map of institutions with one thing that could be displayed behind glass and called evidence. Meanwhile, the real organization of adult life remained on paper and wood. Chests with iron fittings, sealed with official stamps, written access rights to rooms, guarantors in parish books, a set of legal responses to misconduct, from monetary penalties to temporary expulsion from the guild. Where cruelty occurred, it was recorded as a social fact and dealt with through property, responsibility, and reputation. Metal on the body had no place in this accounting system, not because society was gentler, but because the control machine already worked perfectly well without it, taking advantage of what gave it more leverage and less friction: the right to dispose, the right to prevent, the right to pay for the consequences of misconduct at someone else's expense. Therefore, the display case in which the spiked belt gleams is not a window into the Dark Ages, but a mirror of late anxiety, seeking to explain the present with the cruelty of others, rather than acknowledging one's own habit of paper restraint. Returning to the document allows us to see the final picture without unnecessary drama. In one case from the mature communal era, adult spouses arrange separate access to rooms and chests. Keys are distributed on certain days, a custodian is appointed in case of illness, and a list of papers and coins is described in detail. The court accepts a receipt for peaceful behavior, with guarantors and the amount of the penalty for violation. In another urban story, an adult guardian is required to report on household and maintenance expenses and keep the keys to the storeroom only until evening, after which they must be returned to the eldest member of the family. The guild charter lists a scale of punishments for night visits by adult apprentices. First a fine, then a temporary ban on work, then expulsion. The sacred offices record penitential visits and monetary donations to help the poor. Medical advice recommends moderation, distribution of work and sleep, rather than mechanical tightening of belts. These diverse fragments have a common thread. Power over the adult body is not a single lock, but an infrastructure of access and duty. Where the display case requires spikes, the archive shows keys. Where legend awaits the eternal belt, the document pulls a stamped paper from the chest. Where memory prefers spectacle, life presents the bill. And therefore, an honest exhibition about the normalization of feelings and desires should not revolve around late iron, but around real levers. Marriage contracts with provisions about personal belongings, guardianship and suretyship, books of fines and exclusions, house rules where staircases and locks are described. Such an exhibition is less spectacular, but it is precisely what explains fear. The fear of mature people in old cities did not sparkle with steel. It rustled with parchment and jingled with coins. It closed and opened doors. It depended on those who had seals, keys, and the right to judge. And in this last frame, the meaning is strangely simple. The iron from the display case remains a metaphor for fear, while the real levers are property rights and power, used as the usual tools of everyday control over destiny.